Good morning, everybody, or good afternoon, wherever you may be. I'm Adam Lupel, IPI Vice President, and it is my pleasure to welcome you to this virtual policy forum event on UN Special Political Missions and Protection, a principled approach for research and policymaking, co-hosted by the Ministry of Foreign Affairs of the Kingdom of the Netherlands. Many thanks to the Netherlands for their leadership on this issue and for their support for IPI's Protection of Civilians program. Special political missions regularly operate in conflict and post-conflict context where civilians are at risk and in need of protection, for example, in Iraq, Darfur, Colombia. And the Security Council has started providing special political missions with mandates to protect. The most striking recent example being the United Nations Integrated Transition Assistance Mission in Sudan, UNATAMS, which is mandated to support civilian protection. But even when special political missions do not have such a mandate, protection remains critical to their efforts. As a result, increasingly, thought is being given to how the UN can better conceptualize, equip, and support protection efforts in the absence of peacekeeping troops. Just last week, Security Council Resolution 2594 was adopted by consensus, highlighting the importance of a United Nations presence appropriately configured to provide support to protection of civilians' efforts during transitions, recalling several manners to do so without uniformed personnel. Also, just last week, the long-awaited report of the Secretary General, Our Common Agenda, was released. It calls for the Secretariat and the UN system to support a renewed social contract, which ensures inclusion, protection, and participation, and it also anticipates the development of a UN system-wide agenda for protection. Thus, as the UN Secretariat looks ahead to articulate and implement a system-wide agenda for protection, we must take the opportunity to explore what a more concrete policy on protection would look like for UN special political missions. What does protection mean for SPMs in the absence of uniformed personnel and the capacity to physically protect? SPMs have a wide variety of mandates, structures, and operational profiles. Can we develop a common understanding of protection across a variety of missions? Should we develop such policy? If so, how can we reconcile multiple distinct yet overlapping conceptions of protection in the UN system, whether in terms of humanitarian, human rights, or peace and security perspectives? Big questions, all of these. But fortunately, we have a great group virtually assembled here to discuss all of it, including IPI non-resident fellow Dirk Jewett, who is the author of an IPI policy paper on UN special political missions and protection, which addresses many of these questions, and I recommend it to you. It's on the link of the event online. But before we turn to Dirk and the other members of our distinguished panel, which I will introduce in a moment, we will hear opening remarks by Ambassador Joke Brandt, permanent representative of the Netherlands to the United Nations. After the opening remarks in the panel, we are looking forward to an interactive dialogue. And so we'll be taking questions from our global audience. So I just want to tell you all to please feel free to ask your questions in the Q&A feature if you are joining us via the Zoom webinar. And for those who are watching over social media platforms, you can leave your questions in the comment sections, and we have staff that are monitoring all that, so will be seen by us as well. With that, Ambassador Brandt, thank you yet again for participating in IPI work. You've been such a great friend of IPI's. Welcome back. The floor is yours.
No, thanks. Thanks very much, Adam, for the opportunity to say a few words again today. Indeed, and good morning, good afternoon, everybody. Let me join Adam in welcoming, all the panelists and all the participants this morning. And I would like to start with a special thank you to IPI for organizing this this policy forum today and for the excellent policy paper that Adam was just referring to, and that is basically the subject of our discussion this morning. The Kingdom of the Netherlands is proud of its partnership with IPI in the area of protection of civilians, and we're very happy to see this as another product of this very fruitful and important partnership. The Netherlands is an A4P champion on protection, and this October we will co-organize with Pakistan a preparatory conference for the peacekeeping ministerial later on in December. And I'm happy to say that a full day of that preparatory conference will be dedicated to protection. But that is, of course, about peacekeeping, and protection of civilians is of course, also crucial for non-peacekeeping sessions. We have seen it, including, much longer in peacekeeping operations, like especially after Rwanda and Srebrenica. But I think it's also clear that it should be central to the mandate of special political missions as well. And you were, Adam, just taking the example of the transition of UNAMID to UNITAMS. And I think it's a very good example, because obviously with the dissolution of UNAMID, the issues for the population, especially protection issues, did not all of a sudden disappear, because, like in Sudan, the special political missions also operate in very complex environments where civilians are actually on the threat. So I think it's about time that we come up with a clear vision on the role of special political missions in protection, as there will be more peacekeeping missions transitioning, and there will be new SPMs mandated. And that's why we, as the Netherlands, really welcome the policy paper, because there's a need for more research and analysis, but also a need for the understanding of what the operational roles of SPMs in protection could be, as you said, with without the presence of a peacekeeping force. This is also why we look forward to the discussion today. I think we have an excellent panel, and we're very eager to hear from the panelists, but we hope to be able to benefit from all the participants' experience and insights, and really encourage you to participate in a very interactive way in this discussion, so we can use all that common joint experience and insights to take this important issue a step further today. I thank you, Adam.
Good. Thank you so much again, Ambassador, for your leadership and support on this topic, and we know that we can count on that continued engagement moving forward. So we're really, really grateful. We'll now turn to our panel. As previously mentioned, we have the author of IPI's policy report on special political missions and protection, Mr. Dirk Jewett, non-resident fellow at IPI and affiliate researcher at the Max Bell School for Public Policy at McGill University. Then we have Ms. Teresa Whitfield, Director of Policy and Mediation Division, UN Department of Political and Peacebuilding Affairs, who will follow, followed by Ms. Danielle Bell, Representative OHCHR and Chief Human Rights Office, UN Assistance Mission for Iraq, and Mr. Raul Rosende, Verification Director, UN Verification Mission in Colombia, to follow up. This is a really great panel with a lot of experience and insight, and so we really look forward to what follows. And again, as the ambassador mentioned, we are looking to have this as an interactive conversation after the presentation. So again, please feel free to put in your questions in the Q&A function or on social media. And with that, I will turn it over to Dirk to give us some insight into his paper and his findings. Dirk, please, the floor is yours.
Thanks very much, Adam, and good morning to everyone. First of all, thank you so much to IPI and to Ambassador Brandt for hosting this discussion, and particularly thanks to the Netherlands for being so sort of willing and supportive to follow this discussion on protection wherever it goes. It's really important, and it makes, I think, a significant contribution. I just wanted to also just say thank you to DPPA, particularly Teresa Whitfield, who's here today, but also her team, Sasha Fong, Renato Mariani and Liliana Setka, without whom really this paper wouldn't have been possible at all, and also to colleagues in the various desks in DPPA, DPO, who were willing to discuss sort of the nuances of protection in their various missions in detail, which was critical for this. So with that, let me share my screen, and I'll just give you a quick overview of the report before passing it on to the panelists. So I was hoping today to just discuss briefly why exactly we're having this conversation today, why protection in special political missions is a timely topic for discussion, to discuss a little bit of the unique characteristics of SPMs and why that matters for protection questions, and some reflections from the field on what that looks like in practice and some of the dilemmas it raises for policy and practice in the UN. So why now? As Adam said, special political missions have played a variety of protection roles for years. UNAMA is probably the most explicit example where since 2008, the mission has had a Security Council mandate to protect civilians, which it does by monitoring civilian casualties. But around the world, special political missions are playing a variety of roles. But recently, the discussion has come to the fore with the drawdown of UNAMID in Darfur and the discussions on what would follow. As has been discussed in more detail in other IPI reports by Daniel Forti and Damien Lilly, the discussion on how to follow up UNAMID's POC role ended in a quote unquote civilian protection mandate for UNITAMS by the Council. With sort of a lot of outstanding questions of what that means. In practice, the sort of primary motivation there, I think, was to manage what Damien has called, the security cliff created by peacekeeping transitions, where you have a significant, outstanding threat to civilians, and yet, a significant drawdown of a peacekeeping operation, and the question of how to manage that ongoing threat of falling to an SPM. And then also, as Adam mentioned, we have the UN Common Agenda, which has come out this week, and the UN system-wide agenda for prevention that is called for in that common agenda. It sort of begs the question of how DPPA will approach its part in that agenda, and so this report tries to suggest some considerations that might go into that sort of positioning of DPPA as we start to define systemic concept for protection in the UN. Before I launch into sort of the specifics, I just wanted to highlight a few kind of unique considerations that are useful to keep in mind when we're talking about policy making for special political missions. As a subset of UN peace operations, they're often thought of in the same breath as peacekeeping operations, but that really does them a disservice because they are unique in their operational, political, and really organizational structures, mandates, roles, and it's really important to come at them with a nuanced perspective. As mentioned in the report, there are sort of three broad categories of SPMs that are delineated in the budgetary structures. I won't go into them in detail, but suffice it to say that SPMs range from very small special envoys that come in and out of countries, to regional offices that cover large numbers of countries, to large operationally heavy peace operations like those in UNAMA and UNAMI that look a lot like peacekeeping operations minus the troops. And so that poses a unique sort of methodological challenge when trying to generalize about SPMs. And so that's important to think about when we're thinking about how to articulate sort of a systematic policy on what protection looks like in those settings. And it's also important to keep in mind when we're trying to identify recommendations for how the Council should discuss these issues. So with that said, the report looks at 4 missions in particular, analyzing their mandates, how they're structured to work on protection, what the impact has been in those countries, and how special political missions have managed the trade-offs between or the mutually reinforcing aspects between their political roles and the protection. So let me discuss those in turn just very briefly. The first is UNAMA in Afghanistan, where of course protection concerns are very top of mind for all of us these days, and I know that Danielle can speak to that in more detail. As I mentioned, UNAMA since 2008 has had a mandate explicitly to protect civilians, which it does by issuing regular reports on civilian casualties. It does so in order to influence belligerent behavior and as a basis for advocacy for changing tactics of all the parties, including both the Taliban and NATO and the United States, in terms of how their conduct of hostilities affects civilians. Interestingly, and has been sort of covered in a variety of places over the years, the UNAMA POC role has often been cited as having been really helpful for growing the mission's political space by creating a platform for building trust among all of the parties. And that relationship between POC and political space, I think, is a really important reflection when we think about the protection roles of SPMs, because it's often mistakenly, I think, thought of as a trade-off, as either or. The next mission that we looked at was the Office of the Special Envoy of the Secretary General in Syria, where the political framework set up by the international community, sort of 2 main tracks, one looking at political issues and another looking at humanitarian, both managed under the Office of the Special Envoy, but initially with a special humanitarian coordinator, initially Jan Egeland, and now at sort of a lower level, convening a humanitarian access discussion under the aegis of the Special Envoy. That mission has engaged heavily in discussions of humanitarian access and assistance, and in doing so has, I think, been criticized in some quarters and hailed in others for bringing a really political perspective to humanitarian discussions, and in the view of some, for politicizing those issues, but in the view of others, for engaging politically in what was already a highly politicized humanitarian space, which was necessary. And we can go into that perhaps further in the discussion. The other 2 missions we looked at were the UN verification mission in Colombia, where the UN's role was very clearly embedded within the larger peace process, and where the mission deploys unarmed, ununiformed monitors to oversee the laying down of arms and the reintegration of the FARC into the Colombian society. And in doing so, arguably plays a protection role, although that role is distinct from that of OHCHR, which maintains a parallel presence in the country, and I know Raul will speak more about that. And then finally, UNITAMs in Sudan, where the format of the UN peace operation in the country was really primarily driven by the aims of the transitional government, and thus forcing the Council and the international community more generally to conceive of a protection role within pretty circumscribed parameters. and they're managing, the obvious protection imperative and that security cliff that I mentioned, while also contending with, the very real operational limitations of a special political mission based in Khartoum as opposed to Darfur, with very limited operational capacities. And thus we see, a focus primarily on supporting national protection strategies, which certainly I think in the eyes of many is a model for future roles of special political missions in this regard, including, for example, in the Democratic Republic of the Congo, where people are now beginning to think about what a follow-on mission to MONUSCO might look like. So on the basis of those 4 missions and sort of a larger review, the paper identifies sort of a non-exclusive typology of the protection functions that SPMs variously play. Just quickly to cover them, they include influencing party behavior, including by the advocacy that was characterized in Afghanistan, through early warning, prevention, and local mediation to prevent protection threats, by supporting national protection strategies a la Sudan, by managing protection threats during transitions from larger political and peacekeeping presences, and by physical presence. Though I want to just hold on that for a moment because it's probably the most, I think, controversial aspect highlighted in the paper, which is the notion that special political missions, by virtue of their physical presence, can play a protective role that is often kind of treated as a corollary to peacekeeping operations, where the presence of peacekeepers is commonly understood to have a deterrent effect on belligerents. I think controversial because special political missions obviously have no capacity to use force, and I think there is a real and understandable reticence among a lot of special political missions to claim that they play this role because they are concerned about raising expectations in this regard, and I think that is a really reasonable and an important concern that we need to take into consideration, especially when we're talking about mandates. However, on the other hand, we see a lot of examples where non-violent physical interventions by special political missions, for example, by visiting places of detention, by engaging publicly and personally with political actors or activists that may be at risk of violence, does have an effect that is real and that should be, I think, documented. And so that's a trade-off that I think we need to manage carefully. The last 3 roles that we highlighted in the report are negotiating humanitarian access and assistance, also not uncontroversial, working with peacekeeping operations to sort of maximize the UN's collective impact on protection, and that, for example, is seen in Sudan, South Sudan, where you have a mission in country and a special envoy that works in concert with it. And then just more generally, all special political missions have an innate responsibility and often an explicit mandate to support and protect human rights, and that has implies an innate protection role as well. And so just finally, and I won't go into much detail, but the report makes a number of recommendations on how policy and thinking could continue in this area, which includes more thinking about what protection means under Chapter 6 mandates, which has not been sort of theorized in great detail, to develop a repertoire of good practice within the broad spectrum of operational and political roles of SPMs, to consider mandates for protection, but only where they add value and without creating new terminology. And in particular there, to resist what might be an urge in the Council to mandate special political missions with protection in the absence of the political will necessary to sort of make that a meaningful mandate. The report recommends more thinking on political humanitarian trade-offs in situations in which the humanitarian space is highly politicized, such as that in Syria. And finally, to think more seriously about protection as a subset of political strategy, noting that protection roles can have a positive effect on missions' political space. So with that, let me hand over to our other panelists, and thank you so much for your attention.
Great. Thank you, Dirk. There's a lot there. It's a really substantive report. Thank you for taking us through it. I think the key is why now, where we find ourselves in this moment of transition in which we recognize that the need for protection doesn't end when PKOs exit, but it's difficult to understand really systemically what protection means in these new environments, and I think your report really helps us to begin thinking through that. But listening to you with the case studies, reading the report, it really does. Part of me asks, is this one thing we're talking about? These different kinds of SPMs, as you lay out, really quite different. And so I think some of this more substantive thinking that you're asking more broadly about what does protection mean under Chapter 6 writ large is really important. And we look forward to thinking further through this with you today and beyond. And to help us continue to do that and how the Secretariat is handling this, we have Teresa Whitfield, no one better placed to talk us through this. Teresa is, again, Director of Policy Mediation Division at DPPA. Teresa, please, the floor is yours.
Thanks so much, Adam, and thank you to IPI for convening this meeting, to Ambassador Brandt for her participation and the Netherlands' support of this work, and really a huge thanks to Dirk for the study, which we've been quite closely involved in, and we really welcome as a contribution to the evolution of our thinking on this critical issue. It's great to be joined by Danielle and Raoul in this conversation to make sure that our consideration of protection remains rooted in our work in the field. The issue of what SPMs do and cannot do to further protection has long been a critical one for us. Obviously, as already mentioned, it gained new impetus last year as UNAMID was ending its mandate, and a new special political mission, UNITAMS, was deployed to support Sudan through its political transition. But human rights, and in particular helping ensure full protection of the rights of civilian populations, have always been a central pillar of the work of SPMs. And the launch of the Secretary General's call to action on human rights at a time when the cause of human rights faces major challenges, as he has put it, reinforces our determination to hold human rights at the core of the UN's work. And especially, I'd note, in the context of the development of a new system-wide agenda for protection, which is coming out of the call to action on human rights. As you know, won't go into too many details about what SPMs are, but they're civilian missions mandated by the Security Council, sometimes the General Assembly, and deployed under Chapter 6 of the Charter. They do not have an authorization from the Security Council to use force, and they are deployed on the basis of consent from the host country or region. The diversity of SPMs, we would think, is one of their greatest assets. It allows for missions to be tailored for the environment in which they operate, but it also means that it's difficult and challenging for us to generalize across missions. The way SPMs support human rights and protection is no exception to this, as Dirk's paper makes clear. It varies significantly from mission to mission. That said, as diverse as they are, I think all SPMs share a central objective: to use their political and good offices' role to advance peace and contribute to the peaceful settlement of disputes. Ending hostilities, facilitating local or national ceasefires, and promoting dialogue and political engagement in some of the ways in which SPMs seek to increase peacefulness overall. In some contexts, this may involve working to change the behavior of parties who engage in violence against civilians in Libya, Syria, or Yemen, for example, or engaging at a high level to achieve conditions for the delivery of humanitarian assistance, Syria, Yemen, Afghanistan. But in addition to their political role, many SPMs are mandated to contribute directly to the promotion and protection of human rights. 6 have dedicated integrated human rights components: Afghanistan, Haiti, Iraq, Libya, Somalia, and Sudan. These broad human rights mandates anchor their protection work in a number of different ways. Dirk mentioned the example of Afghanistan, but in addition, in Somalia, for example, UNSOM's role in implementing the human rights due diligence policy has provided a useful framework to engage with the government to ensure that security forces receiving the UN support, including through the African Union mission to Somalia, are not engaged in human rights violations. And we'll be hearing shortly from Danielle on the work in Iraq. Meanwhile, some SPMs are also requested to support host governments to carry out specialized mandates related to the protection of specific groups, such as children, women, or those vulnerable to sexual violence in conflict. This primarily involves advisory and capacity building services in addition to monitoring and reporting. There's been several references to the critical importance of attention to questions of protection in times of transition, especially when a peacekeeping mission with a Chapter 7 mandate to protect civilians and a large number of troops ends its presence. Security Council Resolution 2594, which was adopted last week, recognizes the central role played by a host country in protecting civilians within its territory and encourages governments to develop national plans for this purpose with assistance from, quote, appropriately configured UN missions. This is the approach we've been pursuing in Sudan. UNITAMS was mandated by the Council to support national and local authorities on civilian protection, in particular focusing on protection of internally displaced persons in the conflict-affected areas. And the Security Council resolution and the discussions around it are indicative of, as Dirk mentioned, the fact that we'll be looking to this model as we consider down the line other situations of transitions. To wrap up, and looking forward to the discussion later, how SPMs engage on more dedicated protection functions is shaped by their Chapter 6 mandates, especially relating to human rights and capabilities at their disposal. Yet the political mandates of SPMs to promote peaceful and sustainable solutions and the UN's unwavering commitment to human rights across its activities ensure that all SPMs have the goal of creating an environment that is safer for civilians at their core. As we work to achieve greater clarity and understanding of the contributions that SPMs and DPPA more broadly make to the protection agenda, we'll certainly take note of the recommendations put forward in this study, many of which are very much in line with our own thinking, and look forward to continuing discussions on this subject. Thank you.
Fantastic. Thank you, Teresa. So much there. I think, continuing this conversation about the diversity, it's interesting to say that the diversity is one of the greatest assets of SPMs, but of course it does make it difficult to generalize. But I really appreciate the points about human rights that are at the core of all of the UN's work, and that all SPMs, no matter how diverse, are using political tools to help encourage peacefulness. And no matter what the mandate is, human rights remains at the center of all UN's work in the field and elsewhere. So that's actually a very good transition to our next speaker. We have Danielle Bell, representative of OHCHR and Chief Human Rights Office at the UN Assistance Mission for Iraq. Danielle, please, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Adam. And good morning and good evening, everyone from Baghdad. First, sincere thanks to the International Peace Institute and Ambassador Brandt for organizing today's event. And again, big thanks and kudos to IPI for producing this comprehensive and insightful report, which included the remarkable protection outcomes which UNAMA in Afghanistan achieved. As the report notes, the IPI report notes, UNAMA's activities were based on proactive monitoring and documentation of civilian casualties using a clear methodology and legal framework, which enabled results-based engagement with Afghan security forces international security forces and the Taliban to mitigate civilian harm with measurable changes in protection through shifting tactics. I led this body of work in Afghanistan for 7 years, and so during the questions would be happy to respond to any questions on the methodology, etc. But today, I would like to focus on Iraq, specifically how the work of UNAMA's Human Rights Office contributes to civilian protection. So in Iraq, we continue to document civilian harm in order to identify trends and provide early warning of renewed or intensifying violence. However, in the current post-ISIL context, the nature of our work has necessarily shifted in response to the evolving political and security landscape. Our position is that the best way to protect Iraqi civilians is to create conditions conducive to mitigating all forms of violence through promoting accountability and respect for human rights and the rule of law. For example, UNAMA's work to protect human rights in the administration of justice serves as a powerful tool of conflict prevention. This work includes detention monitoring, trial observation, and ongoing engagement with justice authorities to promote compliance with fair trial standards and detention safeguards. Our team has monitored 800 ISIL trials across 9 governorates and conducted over 300 interviews with detainees and their families. Iraq also has a pioneering role in investigating and adjudicating terrorism cases, taking on great responsibility. Our findings, however, show that fair trial standards are not respected in relation to these trials, leaving victims of ISIL atrocities behind and risking a discriminatory application of justice. Torture for confessions is also common, coupled with a lack of respect for detention safeguards, as outlined in our latest report on torture prevention, which was issued last month. Please note, the central objective of this work is to move beyond debating the existence or the extent of these practices, but to instead focus on supporting government efforts to strengthen compliance with its own legal framework. By working alongside the government using a human rights-based preventative approach, rather than like naming and shaming and criticism, the dialogue remains anchored in behavioral changes and systemic results. This approach has also led to projects developed jointly with judiciary, such as fair trial guidelines, roundtables, trainings, and public awareness campaigns. Similar comprehensive approaches are applied to our other priority areas, such as enforced disappearances, rights of minorities, child protection, preventing gender-based violence, and freedom of expression. For example, in May of this year, we issued a report on freedom of expression focused on Kurdistan region, which highlighted a pattern of repressive actions by the authorities against critics, including intimidation of journalists, arbitrary arrest and detention, and unfair trials. The report's recommendations are part of an ongoing dialogue we have with the Kurdistan regional government. I will now provide a more detailed example of how our work protects Iraqi civilians engaged in political dissent. In October 2019, massive anti-government demonstrations erupted throughout the country. Excessive use of force, including the use of live ammunition, killed over 500 and injured thousands. Since then, our team has documented a disturbing and continued pattern of human rights violations and abuses against activists, including killings, disappearances, and torture, mainly attributed to unknown militia. The continued impunity for these abuses erodes trust in government, perpetuates fear, and drives instability. We've released, since October 2019, we've released 6 public reports on this issue, focused on protection and accountability. So this public face of our work draws attention to injustice and the suffering of victims. However, our main objective is to promote changes in government behavior, both in their own forces and in relation to protecting protesters from armed actors through the provision of credible and reliable information on an extremely politicized topic which has been prone to misinformation. We've seen some results, such as the establishment of a fact-finding commission, some investigations, compensation paid, and improved conduct by Iraqi security forces, particularly during protests. This has been crucial during the build-up to elections, which are scheduled to take place next month. More broadly, however, the regular and objective reporting of these human rights concerns also enhance the mission's credibility as an impartial actor, creating space for UNAMA, all parts of the mission, to engage effectively with both demonstrators and government. In summary, how does this work contribute to protection? And more broadly, UNAMA's effectiveness as a special political mission? First, the documentation exposes patterns of harm and puts human rights violations on public record. Otherwise, too many violations would go unnoticed and patterns of harm potentially undetected. Second, improving civilian protection requires accurate data. It is difficult to change what is not measured or understood. Third, strong justice institutions build trust in the system and may prevent the emergence of new grievances and addresses conflict drivers such as injustice and impunity. Despite countless factors that make this process exceedingly challenging, this overall approach of focused documentation coupled with strategic engagement aimed toward behavioral change serves to promote accountability, prevent human rights violations, and protect those most vulnerable. Thank you very much.
Fantastic. Thank you so much for that view from Baghdad. Teresa began by saying her report by saying that it's really important that we root our policy understandings in our experience in the field. So these sort of concrete examples from Iraq really are extremely valuable, and it's a brave work. So really appreciate that. And I think also the focus that you emphasized several times, that the objective is to change government behavior through this monitoring and documentation. Your point that you can't change what you don't understand, and you need accurate data to do that, and the SPMs are really critically provide that critical function there on the ground to do that. So thank you again. And now we will turn to another example from the field, turning to Colombia, and Raul Rosende, Director of the UN Verification Mission in Colombia. Raul, please, the floor is yours.
Well, thank you very much to International Peace Academy and to the government of Netherlands for inviting us to this very important event. Initially, I would like to say a word about the situation in Colombia regarding the peace process, and then I would like to highlight a few concepts or a few principles regarding protection. So first, in terms of the Colombian peace process, in 2016, a peace agreement was signed in Cuba between the Colombian government and FARC, the main guerrilla group at that time. As a result of this agreement, I will say that the main source of violence in Colombia for 50 years was brought to an end. This conflict was finalized with the signing of this agreement. As a result of that, also FARC moved forward with a very effective disarmament process in 2017, which was completed in a few months. And then some of the key main indicators of violence nationwide went down. So the achievement of the peace process and the results of the peace agreement were very, very clear. At the same time, we have to say that in Colombia, there are other sources of violence. So I said that the main source for 50 years was the confrontation between FARC and the state. But then there are still other sources of violence. There are other guerrilla groups. There are local mafias. Even there are dissidents of FARC who broke away from the main structure of FARC. So still we have some challenges, and related to these challenges, an issue that I would like to highlight a bit later, which is the difficulty of the state to reach out the territories of conflict, and the difficulty of the state to have control of the territories which have been historically the scenario of violence, of war, so on and so forth. So having said that about the situation regarding the peace process in Colombia, I would like to highlight 3 or 4 key principles in terms of protection, which I think will have to be considered when we try to design a protection strategy. They are very much rooted in the field, and they are very much a reflection from the field. First, I would like to highlight the issue of self-protection, meaning community empowerment. And here I would like to state kind of a rule, although it's not a golden rule. Sometimes it applies, sometimes it doesn't apply, which is the following. The stronger the community organization, the better will be the capacity of this community to deal with the armed groups and to resist the imposition of the armed groups. So community organization in areas of conflict, the capacity of a community to organize itself, it becomes sometimes kind of a shield against violence and against armed groups. If the community is fragmented, if the community is disunited, the armed groups will take advantage of this situation, and they will be more able to impose conditions on the communities. Always the communities in this kind of conflict areas, always the communities are interacting in a way or another with armed groups. They deal over recruitment, trying to reduce the number of people being recruited by the armed group, over planting of landmines, over taxes imposed by the armed groups on the communities. So they are always in this kind of territory, especially when the presence of the armed groups is very strong, they are always dealing with them. If they are well organized, if they are strongly organized, they will be more able to resist the imposition of an armed group. So having strong communities, strongly organized, with good leaders, with representative leaders, will be a mechanism of self-protection. As I said before, sometimes this applies, sometimes it doesn't apply. But it's very important to assess the conditions in the field in order to see if the strengthening of community organization could be a way of reducing violence and, in this sense, enhancing the protection of communities. What can we do on this? Well, sometimes the better option for the international community is doing nothing. if the organization of the community is working well, well, we don't have to do anything. But sometimes the international community, through civil society organizations, through NGOs, through the church, we work a lot in the field with the Catholic Church. Sometimes we can try to promote the strengthening of community organization, and in this way empowering these communities vis-a-vis the armed groups. So first concept, self-protection. Second concept that I would like to highlight, protection by presence. Again, this is not a golden rule. Sometimes it applies, sometimes it doesn't apply. But sometimes the presence of the UN, the presence of a political mission, the presence of other international organizations, even the Catholic Church, legitimate actors, could operate as a dissuasive factor. They can have a dissuasive effect. Sometimes in these territories of conflict, the armed groups try to avoid violating human rights under the watch of the UN. If the UN is there, sometimes the armed groups try to avoid violating human rights because they know that if they do it, they will pay a political cost, and they don't want to pay a political cost. So the presence of the UN in the field missions, is very important in trying to reduce the level of violence and try to dissuade the bad guys from behaving wrongly. I will put just an example. When FARC disarm, they concentrate in 28 assembly areas in the bush, in faraway areas, in order to move forward with the disarmament. And we deploy local teams, and they were living in these areas. They were living in the bush in order to prevent situations of violence. And still, we have those local teams in most of those areas where today still the former combatants are living. So protection by presence, I think, is very important. As I said before, sometimes it doesn't apply. Why? Because unfortunately, when the armed groups are very radical, either ideologically or religiously, or when they are driven by economic purpose, and this happens a lot in Colombia because of narco traffic, sometimes they don't care about paying a political cost, about paying a political price. So if the UN criticizes them, it will not be important for them. But still, I think that the leverage that we have is quite strong. So I think that this concept of protection by presence is key. Third element that I would like to highlight is reintegration of former combatants, and not only former combatants, but also people with military experience. Probably this relates more to reduction of violence than to protection of civilians, but it is related anyway. One of the key challenges and one of the key problems that we have in those kind of countries is the huge amount of people with military experience. And if in addition to the military experience, they have grievances, they have complaints because they don't have jobs, they don't have education, they don't have an income, they easily can go back to violence. And especially taking into consideration that if you speak about somebody who has 5, 10, 15 years of experience in the war, they are an asset. They are an asset for criminal organizations. So they try to recruit them. So the strategies for reintegration of former combatants and people with military experience is really key. And luckily, in Colombia, we have a good experience because the huge majority of FARC members are in the process of reintegration. They are in the legality, and they haven't gone back to war or to violence. And this is a good example. Final point, and very, very shortly, and I think this is the key challenge in terms of a peace process, which is the deployment of the state, the presence of the state in the territories historically affected by war. From my experience, and I am not speaking only about Colombia, but also some other countries where I used to work, this is one of the most difficult tasks in the post-agreement stage. How to deploy the state in the conflict-affected areas. Usually, you know, the conflict take place in the most marginalized, in the poorest area of the country, where the presence of the state has been null historically. So how to build up the presence of the state? This will take years, but it's important to start this process in the immediate period after the peace agreement, because those are the areas where usually, if the state is not able to establish its presence, those are the areas which will be more affected by violence and in which the civilians will be more affected by violations of human rights. And just 2 points in order to define how this deployment of the state should take place. First, it should be legitimate. It will have to have the support of the people. And this is not a given. Sometimes the people do not want to have the presence of the state, period. And secondly, it is very important to have a comprehensive presence. It's not just the army, it's not just the police, it's a comprehensive presence of the state with the civilian agencies, and it should be coordinated. Sometimes the right hand of the state doesn't know what the left hand of the state does. So these are a few principles, but again, I think that this is one of the key challenges for protection of civilians in a peace process. Thank you very much.
Great, Raul. Thank you so much for, again, really concrete examples from the field, from Colombia, and in particular for an SPM that is at work, embedded or helping to implement a peace process. You mentioned issue of self-protection, protection by presence, reintegration of combatants, and of course the key challenge of deployment of the state in a legitimate manner in regions formerly affected by the conflict. It's interesting counterpoint to me, the issue that you raise about self-protection. We talked with Danielle about affecting government, changing government action and your behavior, and you're looking at the ways in which strengthening at the community level can help to serve protection, increasing local resilience, which is interesting. Maybe a point of discussion about the variety of techniques there. We've got now about a little bit over half an hour for discussion. For those watching online, again, I encourage you to insert some questions in the chat. I can start out with a couple questions of my own, or some observations looking back at the paper. One thing is, Dirk, there were two big elements that I took from the paper that maybe did not come out as much in this conversation that maybe we could address, and that is, one is the issue of dilemmas, of the real dilemmas here that the system has to face, and then also this issue that you raise about the dark side of the mandates, that this risk of protection that missions are getting mandated to provide protection, but not necessarily given the tools to do so, is something that we see with peacekeeping operations, and are at risk of seeing that with SPMs as well, even though, as Teresa highlighted, whatever the mandate, human rights protection is a part of the UN work. I wonder if maybe you could say a couple of words about those, and maybe we could get a couple of reactions from the rest of the panel on those two elements. Dirk?
Yeah, thanks, Adam. That's a very good point. And for those who might not be familiar with it, when Adam says dark side, what he's referring to is this notion that the Security Council will mandate a mission with a protection responsibility, knowing full well that it is not equipped to do so, or doesn't have the political backing to successfully achieve it, but nevertheless sort of checking the box and achieving the council's sort of minimum moral responsibilities. And the risk, I think, that many of us see here is that the council says, oh, great, we can do that now with special political missions too, not just peacekeeping operations. That's why I think we should resist the notion that special political missions should just be sort of blanket, receive sort of a blanket POC sort of mandate, as is now kind of generally accepted practice for special political missions. You know, in terms of dilemmas, I think Raul really sort of hit on, I think, one of the key decision points for SPM leadership, which is whether or not to, you know, enact a political cost on the parties for doing harm. And I think it's important to emphasize that that's a decision that the SPM leadership make, and it often may be cast in terms of, does exacting that political cost, you know, come at another cost of my political access with the government or with the conflict parties? And I mean, thus it requires courage and is not, shouldn't be taken for granted. And that's why I think we shouldn't be letting SPMs off the hook for their presence effect, for the effect that their willingness to step into places where SPMs or where civilians are at risk to exact that political cost. So I think that kind of access versus protection dilemma is important to hit upon. But the good news, I think, as Danielle mentioned, is that doing that in a professional, in a methodologically rigorous way can actually have the opposite effect of increasing missions credibility among the parties and kind of opening space for support to a political solution.
Great. Thanks, Dirk. And I would just maybe seek if Teresa maybe has some additional thoughts on that. And one thing I guess I would ask then is, recognizing this challenge with the Security Council, what recommendations would you have for those that are drafting Security Council resolutions to help sort of avoid this dark side specifically? Do you have you know, the resolution last week very specifically asked to express its intention to consider appropriate measures through which a mandated, reconfigured UN presence could provide protection for civilian support. What should be in those mandates to avoid this dilemma or this dark side that identifies? Teresa, you want to take some of that?
Yeah, thanks. And really interesting. I mean, great to have the breadth and complexity of what actually happens on the ground being reflected in the presentations by Danielle and Raul. I think I agree with Dirk on the kind of warnings on the dark side. And there's obviously we very concerned about kind of expectation management. Many, or if not most, of our special political missions, if you think about them, yes, we have Colombia and we have Iraq, but we also have, you know, our regional offices. We have a tiny special political mission of the special envoy for Myanmar and so forth, and most of our missions have limited presences away from capitals. So that was, you know, one thing. There are UNAMA and UNAMA in the past certainly have had sub-regional, have had, you know, offices away from the capitals. Most don't. Colombia's had a widespread. So that's one issue of like expectation management in terms of the diversity of missions and missions footprints. I think it's also important to recognize that SPMs have been asked to support protection functions, support the governments and support in Afghanistan, supporting international actors, rather than undertaking classic sort of POC themselves with some of the implications they have. I do think, and it's something, and I mean, we were watching the consideration of the Security Council resolution on transitions very closely, and I do think that some of the language in that resolution particularly just flag operative paragraph 5, which points to a number of different activities and covers a lot of the ground we've heard coming out of Iraq and Colombia, is really helpful, not least because at the end of it, it recalls the primary responsibility of states to protect the population throughout their territories. So I think we have to be careful of expectation management, and we have to be clear. And I do think there's a real sort of, and again, we all went through the learning experience of Sudan, as we've discussed, including states on the Security Council. And there's been a real evolution in the last couple of years, and Dirk's paper helps contribute to this, to the kind of need to be very precise and realistic and manage expectations and get away from the kind of persistent fear that's been around POC, whether in peacekeeping or more broader considerations of protections in SPMs, which has always been that the security, you know, the cliched fear is that the Security Council will ask the UN or dump on the UN protection functions and responsibilities for which it won't have the capacity to deliver. Thanks.
Great. Thank you, Teresa. Danielle, Raul, would you like to engage on this? Danielle, please. Yeah.
Sure.
Great.
I like to speak to Teresa's point about expectation management with respect to the question you asked about the dark side of the mandates. And I'm going to speak from my perspective, from the perspective of somebody who's been working on SPMs and PKs for the past 20 years. So as a field person, we essentially work to, deliver the mandate that we're given. But in the context of an SPM where we don't necessarily have all the tools in the toolbox for protection, where one of our roles is most critical is on coordination with the UNCT, particularly with those UN agencies and entities that do have direct mandates to protect. So for example, when I was part of the UNITAM's initial mission design mission, like the pre-mission planning, one of the major features that we integrated into the planning was very strong engagement with UNCT. So for example, here in Iraq, also in Afghanistan, we worked like this with, UNICEF, IOM, FPA, and other UN actors. That's critical. And the other tools in our toolbox, because we make do with the resources that we have to achieve the best protection results. So we also use the Office of the High Commissioner, Special Procedures, Human Rights Council, although sometimes with limited effect. Regarding your question about drafting of the Security Council resolution, I've had experience with both. So for example, in the context of Afghanistan, where you'd have this, very long mandate, with some language on protection, that was suitable for Afghanistan. Here in Iraq, our mandate, at least for the work we do, is one sentence: promotion of rule of law and human rights and accountability. And so having that broad language in Iraq serves us because we can identify the priorities as they emerge, and we aren't shackled by having to do one thing or another. Having said that, when we are given these mandates, we need resources, but not just the staffing resources, which we typically do have, but what's most crucial is the political support, both from UN and international community. And in the context of both Iraq and Afghanistan, where at least in my experience as being the chief of these human rights components, we've certainly had it. And that's allowed us to push forward on some of the more sensitive work. Thanks.
Great, thanks so much. We're gonna do Rule. You can respond to these questions. I also have one specific question for you from the chat, from the Q&A that you can wrap into as well. And this is from participant Sally Sharif. And she asks, especially on the SPM in Colombia, she would like to know how the mission has attempted to protect a specific class of targeted civilians, the social and indigenous leaders, whose assassinations have increased manifold since the signing of the peace agreement with the FARC. So if you could address that specific protection concern as well, and anything you want to add on the Security Council question. Raul, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Adam. Perhaps regarding the first issue, I will say the following. The Security Council has assigned to us the mandate for verification of the peace agreement. However, verification is not just verification. It's not just passive verification, going to the field, verify is the commitment was achieved or not, and then to report that to the Security Council. This is a passive way of verification that doesn't help quite a lot. We have tried to develop the concept of proactive verification, meaning not just to verify, but try to support and to help the parties in implementing the peace agreement. Facilitating the context between the parties, trying to broker agreements on some specific issues, try also to propose ways and solutions to specific challenges and problems that the implementation means. And here there is a concept that is very important to take into account. When you have a peace agreement, this doesn't mean that the negotiation ends there. this is the beginning of a different form, a different way of negotiation. The parties should continue negotiating even after the peace agreement, because what the peace agreement can establish is some general agreement on specific issues, but then there are a lot of issues that are not foreseen in the peace agreement. So it's very important for the parties, even after the peace agreement, to keep the relationship, to keep the dialogue, and to continue negotiating on specific aspect of the implementation of the peace agreement. So this is why we try to develop this concept of proactive verification, not just to verify if the commitments were implemented or not, but also try to help the parties in continuing the communication between them and trying together to sort out specific problems derived from the implementation of the agreement. So again, the Security Council has assigned to us the role or the mandate of verification, but verification is much more than verifying the implementation of the agreement. It's also trying to support the parties in the implementation of the agreement, and this concept that the final agreement doesn't mean an end to the negotiation process. It's the beginning of a new way of negotiations. Regarding the question that was formulated, I will say that Colombia is a very unique country in the sense that although the presence of the state in the territories is very weak in some part of the country, especially in the conflict affected territories historically, at the same time, Colombia is very sophisticated in terms of the legal system, the overall legal system. And the Colombian constitution, which is one of the most advanced in Latin America, contemplate the functioning of kind of control agencies. I mean, agencies which specific role is to control the functioning of the state. Kind of ombudsman. There are different kind of ombudsmans in the Colombian legal system. So for us, it has been very important to build alliances with these ombudsmans and with these control mechanisms in order to try to enhance and strengthen the protection mechanisms in the territories. We have had a big problem in the implementation of the peace agreement, which is the killing of social leaders and the killing of former combatants, which is a big challenge in the implementation of the peace agreement. So when we build alliances with this kind of state agencies, control state agencies, it's a way of amplifying, trying to amplify our advocacy. It's not just the UN doing advocacy by itself. It's the UN building alliances with other actors, with other agencies, in order to amplify and be more effective in terms of our advocacy to protect civilians, to protect social leaders, and to protect former combatants. Thank you.
Great, thanks. We've got about 15 minutes left. I've got a couple questions. So let's try to do one more round of questions, and then we'll come back for final remarks. I have one sort of general question, and then one that I think really is maybe best directed towards Teresa, but I'll pose it, and others can respond if you like. I'll take these together. So the more general question is from Laura McCready. And this kind of gets at a bit of the dilemma question, specifically the political humanitarian dilemma that is discussed a bit in the paper. And she asks, what are some examples of good practices or lessons learned on protection and SPMs related to coordination across humanitarian and prevention of peacemaking tools in politicized humanitarian access negotiations? I know this is often a bit of a hot button issue related to humanitarian principles and the political dilemmas that arise. And then the specific question that maybe is, I would say, is directed mostly at Teresa, but others can respond too, is that this is from Peter Schumann, retired UNAMED senior staff member, who asked, thank you for the empirical examples of SPMs and POC. And he asked, could you please report on or discuss results, outcomes of the challenges of the revised UNATAM's POC mandate and the strategy applied, how has that been successful or not? In particular, the measures implemented by the SPM leadership in support of the government of Sudan's POC strategy. So if Teresa or others want to respond to that, that would be great. But Dirk, let's could we go back to you on the issue of the politicized humanitarian access and related to protection?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a good question, and it's kind of at the core of the dilemmas I think that we need to look at more going forward. The Syria example is sort of the most often cited, and whether the special envoy's political engagement in negotiating humanitarian access and assistance there is a good practice or a bad practice, I think very much depends on who you ask. But I think there are other examples that are really instructive as well, and that includes how peace operations have managed security considerations during public health crises. For example, MONUSCO's role around the 2018 to 2020 Ebola outbreak in Eastern DRC, which was equally controversial and related to these questions of whether providing security or engaging in security discussions with actors on the ground helped or hindered the public health response. And that obviously will be very live as COVID continues and as the vaccine rolls out to many of the countries in which peace operations work. I think one good practice that has clearly come out there, and Raul sort of referred to it, is understanding the localized political economy of the conflict and how individual actors play into that and where their motivations lie, and that should help you determine how you engage, whether you engage, and whether there is scope to affect the behavior of a specific belligerent by exacting a political cost, for example, or whether doing nothing actually is more helpful or supporting community self-protection strategies.
Great. Thanks, Dirk. Teresa?
Thanks. Just a kind of a quick add-on to what Dirk's answer, and I think there's as many of you will know, there's a lot of focus at the moment on integration of the UN's activities and engagements, whether in integrated mission settings or outside it. And I do think the protection agenda is a big test of this. And as Danielle mentioned, the role of the UN country team and the resources they bring to the table, as well as including in specific protection activities, are really essential in many contexts to complement the limited capacity that SPMs may bring. This is a point that's also relevant to Sudan, where obviously the UNATAM's relationship to the UN country team in this area is absolutely critical as we move forward. I'm not a Sudan expert, so I have the broad outlines of what UNATAMS is doing in this area. And I'd also note that the SRG is briefing the Security Council, I think, right now. And so there will be updated material available. But in broad terms, what the UNATAMS and the country team are trying to do is supporting the government's national plan for the protection of civilians, focusing on prevention and establishing an enabled environment. It involves a number of different things, kind of working to strengthen the judiciary and police advice and a range of other activities. But let's look to what the SRSG is telling the council this morning on how all of that is going.
Great. Thank you, Teresa. Danielle, on the political humanitarian dilemmas, trade-offs, do you have any insight on that from Iraq or Afghanistan?
For both Iraq, Afghanistan, and other PKs that I've worked on at the outset, with the missions, the integration of protection function into the human rights component has been very effective. So this is the integration of child protection, children in armed conflict, conflict-related sexual violence, and protection of civilians under the human rights component, the remit of the human rights component. And there was different mixed feelings on that, which I can understand, but yes, it's a good use of resources, but more importantly, it makes us more effective and consistent, this integration. And so, for example, there's often a false perception that there's a disconnect between the humanitarian and the human rights work, and that we're separate, and that our work is so sensitive and so political that it's going to undermine the work of the humanitarians. That's simply not true. We work hand in hand with our humanitarian partners. So, for example, I have this kind of saying, one UN, one figure, one number. So we have the same figures, the same data, so that, and the other entities, so for example, UNHCR, UNICEF, UNDP, when they're doing their field work, when they hear human rights cases, they refer them back to us. One of the things I would also like to highlight as good practice is having very effective and well-functioning protection clusters. I'll stop there, but I'll respond to any more questions more specifically on this. Thanks.
Great, thank you. Raul, any points on this? Let me actually, can I pose one last question, and then Raul, I'm going to go to you to maybe respond to the questions and use it as the opportunity to give any final remarks, and then we'll go back and end with each of the panelists to give any final thoughts in this last round as we close. We just got about 10 minutes. And the final question, just adding on, Raul, is relates to this question of the humanitarian actors, in that we this comes from Semra Asefa. And he asks, if I can just summarize, he wonders about duplication with other UN actors, and would be interested to know how that works. I think sometimes when in this discussion, in my mind, I've been thinking about the big integrated missions, but as Dirk started out in the typology, you have some really small missions in which the relationship with the country team is critical. And so I'm wondering, how do we understand that in order that the SPMs can best reinforce country team capacity? So Raul, if you could respond to these questions and also wrap it up into any final remarks. And then what I'm going to do is I'll go to Danielle, Teresa, and then Dirk, you'll have the final word as the author of our paper on reverse order. Raul, please. I know, final thoughts and responses to the questions, if any.
Yes, thank you, Adam. Regarding the duplication, well, of course, one of the very simple answers will be coordination. We need more coordination. In Colombia, we do not have an integrated mission. It is a separated mission. However, still, we coordinate a lot. We are part of the UNCT, of course. Also, we partake in the local coordination mechanisms that the UN has in the field. So we try to coordinate quite substantially, both at the national level and in the field. We have joint field missions. Sometimes we have joint investigations on specific cases. Of course, there are some agencies which mandate is closer to us, and we work more with them. We work quite a lot with OECHR, with UNODC, which here in Colombia is very important, as you can imagine, with the UNHCR. And I will also highlight one element that in Colombia is quite important. Here there is a multi-donor trust fund. So the donors have put quite a lot of money in this basket managed by the RCHC office. Of course, we as a political mission, we are not an implementing partner, but we interact and we coordinate quite a lot with the management of this trust fund in order to tell them about the bottlenecks of the implementation of the peace agreement. And I think this is a good way of coordination. We do not receive funds from them, but we tell them about our assessment of the blockages, the bottlenecks in the implementation of the peace agreement. meaning reintegration of former combatants, rural reform in the territories, protection of human rights, so on and so forth. So I think this is a good way of coordinating and of trying to work together, even in a context in which we do not have an integrated mission. As a final remark, well, I would like to say a word in the field. Really, I believe a lot on the issue of the dissuasive effect of the UN presence, and it's not just the UN presence; it's the UN advocating, is the UN negotiating, is the UN engaging with the local actors in order to try to reduce the violence and protect civilians. In Colombia, we will face a quite difficult and challenging time in the coming months because we will have elections in 2022. And you know, in every country, elections means polarization and the possibility of increasing of violence, especially in the territories. So our quite extended presence in the field will be an asset for us, for the UN system, for the international community, in order to try to prevent the violence and protect civilians in a better way. Thank you, Adam.
Great, thank you, Raul. Danielle, any final responses or final words?
Very quick, I echo the words of Raul regarding the criticality of coordination, the critical role that both the political side and the human rights working together. But I would also add that I've only discussed today Iraq and Afghanistan, and across the SPMs there is so much good practice. Somalia was mentioned. I would suggest, if possible, that there be more events like this where we could bring together more missions, and then somehow pool these great resources, ideas, and best practices. I know that the best practices policy unit in New York compiles some, but would be great if this could be disseminated and further events like this held. And again, thanks for the excellent work with this paper. Thank you.
Great, great. Thank you, Danielle. If the Netherlands is still listening, maybe we can follow through on that and do some more work on this in the future. Bring together the events. I mean, the country teams and missions, as you suggested, would be fantastic. Teresa, please, if any final words.
Thank you very much. Just to say that for us, this has been super helpful, not just this meeting, but the process that lay behind it and the development of the paper. And I think it's really contributed in a positive way to a kind of collective conversation that's happening within the Secretariat across SPMs. And we've had the benefits of virtual meetings is it has facilitated these kind of exchanges and making sure that we have proper field participation in them, and that's really welcome. I also, as I mentioned before, I think the Security Council resolution is helpful in moving forward in this area, and we're all generally getting a better sense of what's possible. The points about integration are really key, because as we heard from Raul speaking from a non-integrated mission and Danielle speaking from an integrated mission, there are different ways of doing coordination and integration in different settings, and having a sense of how we collectively address what is a collective responsibility to engage to the utmost of our abilities on protection is really key across all of our work. It will look, as we said at the beginning, very different in different places because of the diversity of SPMs and their size and capacity and reach and footprint and so forth. But it's a thread that runs through all of them. So thank you.
Thank you, Teresa. Excellent. Dirk, you've got the final word. Please, floor is yours.
Okay, well, one thought on integration, but first, then let me just take the opportunity to thank you, Adam, and the Netherlands and IPI generally, and DPPA for participating in this and for organizing the discussion today. This has been super interesting, and just really appreciate the opportunity. Just to add on the integration issue, you know, I think the challenges facing SPMs, especially as you get towards the smaller envoy type of model, is quite similar to the challenges facing resident coordinators in non-mission settings today. And as this conversation sort of goes ahead, I think it's really worth increasing the interplay between the best practices we've learned on conflict prevention and the promotion of human rights in those settings, including, for example, a really good set of papers that UNU did a couple of years ago on conflict prevention in those settings, and protection in SPM settings. That includes, for example, how to work in authoritarian settings where the sort of hard leverage of the UN is really low, or appears to be really low, using data and technical support as entry points for advocacy, how rallying the UN, which as we all know can sometimes be quite donor driven around principled issues and normative imperatives. I think all of that is equally relevant to SPMs. So hopefully we can have kind of a greater dialogue between those two parts of the system.
Great. Well, this has really been a fascinating conversation. Again, I just want to recommend the report, Dirk's report on special political missions and protection, which is available on IPI's website. I think this conversation was incredibly substantive, with both conceptually and with examples from the field. But I think I'm really welcoming the calls to continue this work. And so I'd just like to pledge that IPI will be continuing this collective conversation, as Teresa calls it. And so I just want to say thank you to all. Thank you to all our listeners. Thank you to the Netherlands, DPPA, and have a great rest of the day, and stay tuned. Thank you. Take care. Bye-bye.